I'm often looking at online articles, essays, and videos about an array of topics. And one that caught my attention was this generational theory. I found it interesting because um, there's a lot of things that happen in the world that, you know, a lot of people have opinions on. And I think overall, you know, there has to be some sort of structure to how things work. I mean, there's cycles in everything from, day and night to, predator prey dynamics. And I think it's kind of naive to think that humans are somehow different or outside of these kind of influences and cycles and aggregate behaviors. Some people have even described, groups of animals as a single organism, such as ants or bees, as being, part of a basically larger organism where they all act together. Well, I think this is very interesting. This generational theory is very interesting because humans are like that too. I think we act together, we work together, we're a social species, if you will. And so this generational theory has been of interest to me. So I thought I'd make a video talking about it a little bit. The basic idea of this theory is that because of the lifetime of a human being and the fact that humans, reproduce and have children, and then there's these generations, not only for a single line or a single family, there can be generations, but for a whole society, there can be generations. And because of this, the theory is that human societies in the aggregate can have generations, and these generations take on a certain form and cause a kind of cycle. So I don't want to go into a lot of detail. Maybe I'll come back with another video analysis, but at the level of just the concept, there are 4 turnings in this theory. So there's the authors describe the 4 turnings as the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis. And then in theory, it starts again, the high, the awakening, unraveling, the crisis. The first thing that sticks out to me is that, let's say you are a human. We all are, I guess. And let's say you live approximately the duration that they talk about these 4 turnings take. So let's say you live to be 80 to 100 years old. If that's the case, then no matter when you're born, no matter which generation you're a part of, you're basically going to live through some form of all of these turnings. Now, obviously, you'll be different ages when you go through the different turnings if you live that long. But all of us, in a sense, will go through all these unless we don't live that long or something else happens in society where these turnings don't all happen. But according to the theory, if you're alive and you sort of live in the same society for basically the majority of your life, you're probably going to see all of these kinds of turnings some point in your life. So that was interesting to me. In a sense, we can think about this theory in like an academic sense, or we can think about this theory in a personal sense. So in addition to these 4 turnings, there's also the 4 archetypes of the generations themselves. So there's a prophet generation, a nomad generation, a hero generation, an artist generation. And in a sense, these generations are linked to these turnings, but that is its own analysis could be done to say, hey, is the generation, is the type of generation, the archetype, children or young adults or middle-aged adults or older people during which part of the turning? And again, look at that kind of thing. But just all of that kind of analysis is a very interesting idea that, in a sense, in the aggregate, if you have a bunch of people together in a society and there's a culture, and at least a significant portion of that society is aware of that culture and is influenced by that culture, then you're going to see these four kinds of sort of phases in a turning, and that they're going to have those four archetypes of generations during that during those four turnings of that full cycle. So that's very interesting to me. When I think about my own life, or I think about things that are happening in the world, I think about my children, my parents, just how all these, how do all these things fit together? So that to me is very interesting. So the next thing I think would be interesting to think about would be kind of going back in time, because the authors do list many generations in their own breakdown to say, okay, we think that our theory is valid by looking back in time and saying, okay, here's all these different cycles, here's all the different generations. And, obviously the farther back in time you go, in general, the average person is going to be less familiar with those generations. But if we go the other direction, instead of starting at the end, if we start more recently, then we can maybe wrap our head around things. I'm sure a lot of us have heard of some of these generational names, right? I feel like a lot of people have heard of the idea of the baby boomer generation, Generation X, the millennial generation, etc. And so if we look at the turnings and the cycles that the authors have talked about, I think it could be interesting to then try to compare that to the archetypes and the turnings themselves. So if we look at the most recent cycle, the cycle that, again, according to this theory, we are now in the fourth turning of this cycle, which is the crisis turning. And this is a Wikipedia entry, so it's written by a community. But if this reflects what the authors are talking about, and for the sake of this discussion, let's just assume that it does, and that kind of it's a theory that can be developed by many people and talked about by many people. We're in this crisis turning, and if you were to talk to the average citizen of the U.S. or the citizen of the West, if you will, they probably wouldn't disagree with you, right? The pandemic, the political instability, all those kinds of things would suggest a crisis. The crisis before that would have been the Great Depression and World War II. I don't know how well the current crisis compares to that, but I think that's an interesting comparison. But anyway, let's just look first at the generations. So according to this theory, the current cycle of the four turnings would start with the baby boomer generation as the prophet archetype. Generation X is the nomad archetype. The millennial generation is the hero archetype. And the really, really young people in our society would be part of this fourth generation, the artist generation. And they're going to sort of, experience their childhood, teenage years as, sort of remembering the crisis or seeing some of that crisis turning. So that's interesting. If I imagine my parents would be basically the baby boomer generation. I can't put myself completely in their shoes, but if I did, they were more at the tail end of the baby boomer generation. And they did not, they were not alive during World War II, but their parents would have been in World War II and experienced the Great Depression and World War II. They would have sort of been raised in the high. Again, they were at the tail end of this, so maybe they didn't see as much of the high as someone who was earlier in the generation. But they probably would have done a lot of their teenage years and young adult years in the second turning, the awakening part of that. And then right then at the tail end of that and at the start of the next generation was approximately when I was born. So I would have experienced and been raised in the unraveling. And now in my young to mid adulthood, I would be experiencing the crisis. So it's interesting to think about how, for instance, when do I experience the crisis? When did my parents experience the crisis? If we go to my parents' parents, my grandparents, they basically missed this crisis or only saw it very briefly. They were pretty old at the time. They might not have even cared that much about it. Their crisis probably would have been this one, right? So my grandparents would have probably been more in the range of, seen these turning. So they would have crossed the cycle. They would have started with the crisis and ended with the unraveling. Whereas my parents' life would be more like this full cycle. And my life will be more like, the second turning, the third turning, the fourth, and then I'll see the next high potentially, but I'll be really old or something. I'll be older when I see it. Maybe I'll live so long that I'll see a second, or I'll see an awakening too, right? So anyway, just interesting to me to think about this theory also personally. Like, what does this mean for me? Or for that matter, think about my children. My children will have been raised in the crisis and maybe kind of like my grandparents, and then they'll see some sort of new high, new awakening. Again, assuming civilization, society doesn't collapse. I mean, that's the next thing I want to talk about, which is, okay, the first thing that comes to mind when I start thinking about this, in addition to just, hey, is this a valid theory? Does this theory describe something real? Is it something that could be used either predictive or understanding our past, or in what ways can this theory be useful? It also makes me think, what do we think of these cycles, right? Of four turnings. The thing that comes to mind are things like the rise and fall of civilizations or empires or whatever. Well, is it possible that not only are there kind of a characteristic element to each of the four turnings in each of the four generations, could there also be a cyclical element or a characteristic element to many cycles? So for instance, maybe if you look at the last four cycles, so this is going back to, the 1700s, is there maybe a high, an awakening, an unraveling, a crisis to the cycles themselves too? If you go back four cycles, this is well before 1776. So if we say specifically look at the United States of America, could there be a high and then an awakening and then an unraveling and then a crisis of cycles, right? Kind of going sort of meta on this idea. So anyway, when if you think about the cycle as maybe like a circle or like a Celtic loop, like a spiral, well, if you stack many of them on top of each other, maybe you get some sort of a loop that's going around and around and around through time. And so maybe there are repetitive cycles, but then what's the bigger picture if you step even farther back, right? One cycle is 80 to 100 years. Well, what if you step back to 400 years or 1600 years? Anyway, that's a thing that comes to mind when I think about the theory. And you look at this, the authors looked back in history and said, hey, our theory, we came up with our theory by looking back and saying, hey, we see this happening in the past. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is like ancient civilizations. What about ancient dynasties of Egypt? How long does a dynastic period last? Now, Egypt obviously is very removed from our current civilization society, but it is, if you go back enough generations, I mean, it is a precursor to where we are now. It's also a period of time where, while we don't know very much about it, we know enough to know that there were, kingdoms and pharaohs and societies and even cycles there where they say, okay, there was a dynastic period, then the old kingdom, then an intermediate period, then a middle kingdom, then an intermediate period, then a new kingdom, then an intermediate period. So even this has a sense of cycles to it, right? Like dynasties, then shorter dynasties, and longer dynasties and shorter dynasties. But the intermediate periods are almost longer than the kingdom periods. Anyway, so if we look at this for the dynastic periods or the kingdom periods, the dynasties are, I guess, longer, and we look at the intermediate periods, and the dynasties that are known are shorter, longer, shorter, longer, shorter. I mean, I wonder if there's something here, but it makes me think of that. But maybe ancient Egypt is too far back or too foreign to what to where we are today. Since there's a lot of talk about democracy, or republic, another thing that might be worth thinking about is ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So if we look at ancient Greece, there were kind of three periods of ancient Greece that historians use to categorize it. Classical Greece, some could say, is like maybe more of a high or a awakening of this civilization. It lasted for 200 years. It's thought to have begun with the last Athenian tyrant and ends with Alexander the Great, whereas the following period after the classical Greece, the Hellenistic period, begins with Alexander the Great and ends with the emergence of the Roman Empire. So you could even argue that the Greek period maybe rose during the classical Greek period and had its high and awakening by getting rid of the tyrants. Maybe that was the way things were before. And then eventually, with the rise of, say, Alexander the Great, and then what followed, maybe it's more of an empire type of a civilization, and then eventually was overthrown by another empire. Well, let's look at the Roman period. The Roman period by historians is often categorized as having a Roman Republic period. Again, maybe Rome is even more illustrative of our modern world in terms of there was a many years of republic, and then something happened, and then there was an empire, right? And there were Caesars, and maybe some would argue that the high was the Roman Republic. Maybe some would argue that the high was the Roman Empire. But eventually it went into decline and fell apart or broke into pieces, or eventually was superseded by, Germanic kings, or, the Middle Ages, Holy Roman Empire, who knows? But it makes me wonder about our current situation, thinking back to the generational theory. There's even been some discussion that with the current political polarization and crisis, if you think of our current turning as a crisis, in theory there's a high that comes after it, but some have said, well, does that mean that the republic period of the US is ending, and there's going to be some sort of great leaders and dictators or emperors, and somehow the power and might and flourishing of the United States is going to turn into some sort of empire and then slowly decline. So anyway, that's the way my thinking went when I hear this theory, which I think is very interesting. And I think a lot could be said about it. And, it is an interesting way of framing history by saying, okay, the human lifespan represents one of these cycles. And of course, there's overlapping generations. So, any one person's lifetime, could cross these boundaries. I mean, these aren't necessarily even boundaries, right? Crisis leads to high doesn't mean there has to be this thick boundary. It's just a way to describe it. But, just the human life cycle affects how societies rise and fall, or go from a high to a crisis, or whatever. Is a very interesting way of looking at things. And again, in terms of looking to the future, you wonder, okay, so there's a high that's going to come next from this crisis. Then, the generations that are involved are going to continue to respond to things that are happening. The mind leaps to wondering what that might be. So anyway, that's enough for this video. Maybe I'll come back and make another one. But anyway, if you have any thoughts, you can reply in the comments or contact me in some other way. Thanks for listening.